Welcome back to the sixth installation of us keeping track of various backfield trends as far as ambiguous or just outright confounding backfields. We're going to begin with the Pittsburgh Steelers once again. Najee Harris was easily the best running back in this game and the most utilized. So he went 14 for 106, averaging 7.6 per carry with a touchdown and a long of 36. Next up in efficiency at least was Jonathan Ward. He had 3 carries for 13 yards, averaging 4.3 per carry with no touchdowns and a long of 6. Jaylen Warren came back, although it wasn't the game any of us were hoping for. He had 6 attempts for 7 yards, averaging only 1.2 per carry with a long of 7 with no touchdown. And then we also had Aaron Shamklin. He received 1 carry for -2 yards and no touchdown. When we look at the receiving work out of the backfield, Najee Harris had 2 targets, 2 receptions, 16 yards, averaging 8.0 per catch with no touchdown. And then Jaylen Warren had 3 targets, 3 receptions, 11 yards, averaging 3.7 per catch and no touchdown. And so this was the game that we all wanted to see from Najee Harris. He was incredibly efficient. He had a long touchdown in which he broke multiple tackles, dove into the end zone. However, if you were a Jaylen Warren owner, this was incredibly disappointing. He wasn't efficient in any facet of the game, while Najee Harris was incredibly efficient all around. When we take a look at the average rush, snap, and target shares versus the Week 6 snap, rush, and target shares, Najee Harris on the season has a 60% snap share, Jaylen Warren has 23%, Aaron Shamklin has 4%, and Jonathan Ward has 1%. When we take a look at the average rush shares through 5 weeks, Najee Harris has 50.25%, Jaylen Warren has 2.64%, Aaron Shamklin has 3.08%, and Jonathan Ward has 1.54%. When we take a look at the average target shares through 5 weeks, Najee Harris led the backfield with 12.54%, Jaylen Warren had 4.67%, and neither of the other 2 running backs had received a target through 5 weeks. Taking a look at Week 6, Najee went from an average of 60% down to 46% in terms of his snap share. I think the game script had a lot to do with this. They were easily winning throughout most of the game. And when we take a look at his rush share in Week 6, his 40.0% is definitely down from his 50.25%. I think the same reasoning stands there. And then as well as his target share of 8.7% is down from 12.54%. The difference, though, is in this game, he was incredibly efficient all around. We've seen in general he hasn't been the most efficient runner on the ground this season, but in terms of the receiving work, he's been pretty good actually. When we look at Jaylen Warren, his 37% snap share easily tops a 23% over the course of the season. His 17.14% of the rush share tops his 2.64%, and then his 13.04% target share also tops the 4.67% for the season. When we look at Jaylen Warren's numbers here, the averages are a little bit skewed by the fact that he's missed some time, and so that depresses them. But when we compare him to Najee directly in this game, while he did finish lower in terms of snap and rush share, he actually did out-target him. And if you're a Jaylen Warren owner, you do have to like that at least, that he finished higher than Najee in terms of target share, but it's just one game, and so I wouldn't read that much into it, but it's good to see that he's being utilized coming back from injury. And in terms of Aaron Shamklin and Jonathan Ward, I definitely wouldn't be worried about either one of them. Neither one of them are remotely as talented as Najee or Jaylen Warren. And so what can we conclude here? Well, I think that we can conclude that Najee finally had an awesome game. We'll look to see if he can keep any sort of consistency in terms of his efficiency. This was a particularly easy matchup. It's not going to be quite as easy from here on out in terms of the matchups by week, but it was good to see that he was much more efficient than Jaylen Warren in this game, at least from his perspective. In terms of Jaylen Warren, it is just one game, but he has been much less effective in this Arthur Smith scheme than he was this past season. This past season, he was actually one of the better running backs in the NFL in terms of advanced analytics. This season, that's not been the case. I think it's potentially a scheme fit issue with him, as well as obviously dealing with injury. And in general, I don't expect the Steelers to be winning most of their matchups by this much, which I think will actually help Najee in terms of his snap and rush share. But his target share remains relatively high considering, and I think that even though he's probably not going to be quite this consistent in terms of the efficiency down the line, and I think we have to be pretty impressed because even though it was an easy matchup, he did what he should have done and he delivered. And as far as Jaylen Warren's concerned, hopefully he has more efficiency and that can up his utilization. But as far as this season, we just haven't seen it. Taking a look at the Bengals backfield, for a third straight week, Chase Brown was much more efficient than Zach Moss, and I think the utilization is starting to show it at this point. besides the fact that Zach Moss did have a fumble lost, and so I do think that's really going to hurt him in the future because he was already trending downwards. Chase Brown in this game finished 10 for 53, averaging 5.3 per carry with a touchdown, and his long of 30 was the touchdown. He broke away at the end of the game and sealed the game for the Bengals. Zach Moss finished 6 for 13, averaging 2.2 per carry, no touchdown, and a long of 7. And so, once again, for a third straight week, Chase Brown was much more efficient. And at this point, especially with that fumble, that is very concerning if you're a Zach Moss owner. And if you're a Chase Brown owner, obviously you love it. Taking a look at the passing game, Zach Moss really wasn't utilized that much either. He had 1 target this week, including 1 reception for 2 yards. He had been really efficient in past weeks. I think that fumble doomed him, though. Chase Brown wasn't particularly efficient through the air. He had 3 targets, 2 receptions, 11 yards, averaging 5.5 per catch and no touchdown. Moving on to the average rush, snap, and target shares through weeks 1 to 5 versus the week 6 snap, rush, and target shares. Zach Moss on the season has 69% of the snaps played. Chase Brown has 31%. When we look at the average rush shares through weeks 1 to 5, Zach Moss has 51.67% to Chase Brown's 34.50%. And then when we take a look at their target shares through weeks 1 to 5, Zach Moss has 10.50% of the target share to Chase Brown's 7.85. When we look at week 6, Zach Moss's snap share went from an average of 69% all the way down to 45% in this one, and Chase Brown's went from 31% on the season up to 62%. And so essentially they flipped. When we look at the rush share, the same thing. Zach Moss only had 30% to his average of 51.67 for the season, and Chase Brown had 50% to the average of 34.50%. And when we look at their target shares, the same exact thing happened. Zach Moss on the season has 10.50%. In this game, he had 4.35%. And on the season, Chase Brown has 7.85%. And that went up to 13.04% last night. And so what can we conclude here? Well, we can conclude that Zach Moss is trending downwards. He's probably not a good start in any format until we see better utilization in terms of volume and then as well as the efficiency going up. And then as far as Chase Brown's considered, I think he's probably an upside RB3 at this point and a fine flex play with definite RB2 upside any given week if he scores a touchdown. And this backfield is going to be quite interesting to track in the future, and we'll have to see if Chase Brown continues this ascension. Taking a look at the Jacksonville backfield, D'Ernest Johnson was by far the most efficient back today. He went 6 for 28, averaging 4.7 per carry with a long of 13 with no touchdown. Tank Bigsby was second with 7 carries for 24 rushing yards, averaging 3.4 per carry, no touchdown with a long of 8. And Etienne did leave with a hamstring injury. He finished with 3 carries for -1 rushing yards with a long of 1 and no touchdown. And so, as far as this week's concerned on the ground, Etienne had a terrible week. Bigsby was pretty inefficient, and I really doubt many people are starting D'Ernest Johnson. When we take a look at the passing game utilization, Etienne, in his 18% of the snaps, did have 1 target, but he failed to haul it in, so zeros across the board. D'Ernest Johnson had 2 targets, including 2 receptions for 16 yards, averaging 8.0 per catch. No touchdown for him, but overall, pretty efficient for D'Ernest Johnson. As far as Bigsby, I wouldn't worry too much because he's been really efficient in 3 of the 4 games that he's really finished. As far as Etienne's considered, though, this is a very concerning trend. In general, he finds himself injured, but to be fair, he toughs out these injuries a lot throughout the years. And so it's just yet another thing. Etienne's supposed to be week to week, so I have to keep track of his status. When you take a look at the average rush, snap, and target shares throughout the first 5 weeks versus what we saw in week 6, throughout the first 5 weeks, Tank Bigsby's played 23% of the snaps. In this game, he played 27%. Throughout the first 5 games, Etienne's played 60%, and this one he only played 18 due to the hamstring injury. And D'Ernest Johnson's played 18% of the snaps through weeks 1 to 5, and he played 56% in this one. And so when we take a look at these snap shares in week 6, I think this is heavily influenced by the fact the Jags were losing by a lot. I think in games in which they're close or potentially winning, if that happens, that Tank Bigsby is going to see a lot more of the snap share. I think that D'Ernest Johnson is just viewed as a much better receiving back, and he probably is too. And so I do think that is going to potentially hurt Bigsby in the long run if he's not able to get more run in the receiving game. And as far as replacing Etienne, he did a reasonable job considering he only had 2 targets, but very concerning for Etienne. When we take a look at the average rush share for Bigsby versus what we saw in this game, on the season he averages 28.73%. In this one he had 35%, so that's up. And as far as ETN's concerned, on the season he had 48.94%. That went down to 15%. D'Ernest Johnson on the season has 9.65%, and then this one he saw 30%. Taking a look at the average target share versus what we saw in week 6, Bigsby averages 0.59% of the targets. Didn't record one in this one. He's only had one on the season, so that's no surprise. ETN on the season has 13.17%. In this one, he only had 2.86%. And as far as D'Ernest Johnson's considered, he has 2.21% on the season. And in this one, he had 5.71%. And so what can we conclude here? Well, I think brighter days are ahead for Bigsby. He's likely to be more efficient than he was in this game, considering how efficient he was in 3 of the first 5 games. As far as ETN's considered, hamstring injuries are rather tricky. The risk of reaggravation is quite high, and so that could potentially be something that lingers for him. And as far as D'Ernest Johnson's considered, I do think that in larger leagues with larger starting lineups, he could be a potential flex play or buy/injury replacement, especially in games in which you think the Jags are going to be losing. There's a decent chance he sees over 50% of the snaps, at least it shows in this game. And so I do think that he is a good pickup if you're in larger leagues. But as far as the valuations for the rest of the season, I think Bigsby still has a ton of upside. I think that he could turn into an RB3 if he's given enough volume consistently. GameScript will decide that. ETN is going to be a little bit tricky because the risk of re-aggravation is certainly there. And while he has been really efficient through the air and at times on the ground, he just hasn't looked the same this year, at least in my opinion. And as far as D'Ernest Johnson's considered, like I said, in deeper leagues, you could definitely add him. He could be a decent bye week/injury replacement in larger leagues, but the upside with Johnson when the other 2 running backs are playing probably isn't nearly as much as we would hope. Taking a look at the Green Bay Packers, Josh Jacobs led the backfield with 18 carries for 62 rushing yards, averaging a measly 3.4 per carry, no touchdown, and a long of 14. However, Emmanuel Wilson was much more efficient. On 7 carries, he had 54 rushing yards, averaging 7.7 per carry, no touchdown, with a long of 16. And so Josh Jacobs hasn't really been that efficient recently. I think some of it has to do with teams are going to focus a little bit more on Josh Jacobs than they are Emmanuel Wilson, which might not be wise, but I think that plays some into this. But when we look at the receiving game, Josh Jacobs was reasonably efficient. He had 3 targets, 3 receptions for 28 receiving yards, averaging 9.3 per catch with no touchdown. And Emmanuel Wilson on 2 targets was pretty efficient as well. 1 reception for 19 receiving yards, 19.0 per catch with no touchdown. And so in this game, while Emmanuel Wilson didn't receive nearly as much usage, he was overall much more efficient than Jacobs. But to be fair to Jacobs, he was pretty efficient through the air. Taking a look at their averages, really this game played out reasonably close to what we would expect in terms of the snap share. On the season, Jacobs averages 65%. In this game, he had 63%. And on the season, Wilson has 30%. In this game, he had 32%. Nothing too crazy there. Taking a look at the rush shares, Josh Jacobs on the season has 56.23%. In this one, it went down to 47.37%. And on the season, Emmanuel Wilson averages 24.61%. And in this one, he had 18.42%. So down for both. But the split between the two of them was relatively the same. And when we look at the target shares, Josh Jacobs averages 5.95% through the first 5 weeks. In this one, he had 9.68%. And Emmanuel Wilson averages 5.15%. And in this one, had 6.45%. And so what can we conclude here? Well, not much changed in this game. But if Emmanuel Wilson is able to be this much more efficient than Josh Jacobs consistently, there is a chance he starts to eat into his workload. But I definitely wouldn't worry anytime soon because Josh Jacobs is probably going to be a little bit more efficient than he was in this one. If you like what you're hearing and seeing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel. I keep tabs of all these various backfields in terms of the average rush, snap, and target shares, and then compare that to what we saw in the current week. And so if you want to see this continue, just like and subscribe. Thanks. Moving on to the Giants backfield, this was absolutely the Tyrone Tracy show. Although he wasn't really very efficient on the ground, he still had a productive day nonetheless. On the ground, he had 17 for 50, averaging 2.9 per carry with a touchdown and a long of 11. Eric Gray had 3 for 13, no touchdown, averaging 4.3 with a long of 6. Through the air, Eric Gray wasn't utilized, but Tyrone Tracy certainly was. He had 6 targets, 6 receptions, 57 receiving yards, averaging 9.5 per catch and no touchdown. And so overall, we'll definitely take the total yardage, the receptions, and the touchdown for Tyrone Tracy. Although we did see the efficiency go from, I believe it was around 7 per carry down to 2.9, although the matchup wasn't particularly amazing. But still, nonetheless, awesome fantasy performance. When we take a look at the average snap, rush, and target shares throughout the season for Singletary, Tracy, and Gray, in this one, Devin Singletary missed it with a groin injury, and so he's not going to have any stats. On the season, Devin Singletary has, for the most part, been a featured back, although Tracy has seen some utilization. Although in this one, once again, he missed it with a groin injury. In this game, Tyrone Tracy played 84% of the snaps, much greater than his 33% average throughout the first 5 weeks. His 54.84% rush share was higher than his average of 19.86%, and then his 16.67% target share was obviously much greater than his 4.6 season average. Eric Gray played 18% of the snaps to his average of 11 throughout the first 5 weeks. He had a 9.68% rush share to his average of 5.72, and while he didn't record a target in this game, he does average 3.11% of the target share. And so what can we conclude here? Well, Tyrone Tracy looked amazing in the receiving game. He wasn't able to get much going on the ground. And so I think that when Singletary comes back, while he did have an amazing week the week before in terms of his efficiency on the ground, I do think we return to some kind of timeshare, but we'll definitely have to keep tabs as to what that timeshare is. Obviously, I think that Tracy has shown that he deserves much more utilization than he saw in the first 4 weeks. I don't think that Tyrone Tracy is going to be overtaking Singletary outright, because the Giants did pay Devin Singletary this offseason. He's likely to play 2 of his 3 years of his contract. And so I don't think they're going to be paying Devin Singletary to do nothing when he's been reasonably efficient himself. But Tyrone Tracy is definitely going to be a factor here. We'll have to see what the timeshare looks like between the two. And as far as Eric Gray is concerned, he's a distant third in the pecking order to Devin Singletary and Tyrone Tracy, so I don't really think he's much of a factor here. I think that Devin Singletary's floor and ceiling are going to be lowered, and Tyrone Tracy's floor and ceiling, at least compared to the first 4 weeks, I think are going to be raised. It's just, this is going to be potentially somewhat of a messy backfield, and so we'll also have to keep tabs on this one because it'll be quite interesting to see what the Giants do considering that they paid Singletary, but Tyrone Tracy has performed quite well in his absence. When we look at the Raiders' backfield, Madison for a second straight game was relatively featured. He had 14 carries for only 33 yards, however, and for a second straight game was quite inefficient on the ground, averaging 2.4 per carry. However, he was able to score a touchdown with a long of 9. Amir Abdullah was pretty efficient for a second straight week. He had 4 carries for 24 rushing yards, averaging 6.0 per carry. No touchdown in this game, but he did have a long of 10. And Dylan Labe, unfortunately for him, he's a rookie. On his first career touch, he fumbled. And so he finished the game with 1 carry for no yards with a fumble. He did not see the field at all after that. Through the air, Alexander Madison was heavily utilized. He had 5 targets, 5 receptions, 32 receiving yards, averaging 6.4 per carry. No touchdown in this one. Still relatively efficient. Not the best in terms of total yardage, considering he had 5 receptions, but definitely not poor or anything. And then Amir Abdullah had 5 targets. However, he was really inefficient. On 5 targets, he had 3 receptions for 14 receiving yards, averaging 4.7 per catch with no touchdown. I really don't think Amir Abdullah in general is going to be that much of a threat to Alexander Madison through the air. But it is interesting to see that Amir Abdullah for his second straight game was much more efficient than Madison. Taking a look at the averages for snap, rush, and target share throughout the first 5 weeks, Zamir White averages 37% of the snap share, 46.62% of the rush share, and 4.3% of the target share. And this one, he didn't play due to a groin injury, so he's not really going to be factored in here. Although he was performing pretty poorly before he failed to play the past 2 games, and so that is worrisome. I think he's an absolute avoid. I wouldn't play him in any format, no matter what. Alexander Madison on the season averages 44% of the snaps played, and this one he went up to 68%, so we'd like to see that if you're an owner. On the season, he has 28.45% of the rush attempts, and this one he had 73.68%. That is featured back territory. When we look at his target share, on the season he averages 7.79%, And in this one, it went all the way up to 13.51%. In this game in general, the running backs were heavily utilized in the passing game. I think the change in quarterback to Aiden O'Connell could have been some of that, as to the preference of what he likes to do in terms of checkdowns. And as far as Amir Abdullah, on the season, he averages 18% of the snaps played, and this one he played 30%. On the season, he has 6.35% of the rush share, and this one he had 21.05%. And on the season, he has 3.8% of the target share, and in this one has 13.51%. And Dylan Labe only played 2% of the snaps. That's one total snap, lost a fumble, and didn't play thereafter. And so what can we conclude here? Well, Alexander Mattison, when Zamir White misses these games, is trending towards being more of a featured back. He's at least by far the most utilized back when that happens. However, he's been very inefficient on the ground when given these opportunities, but to be fair, he is being given the goal line work. And so out of all these running backs, he is the best bet for a touchdown. He's been pretty efficient through the air as well. And so he does provide some value. I'd say in games where Zamir White misses, he's probably a reasonable RB3 flex play. But when Zamir White comes back, I think this backfield is going to return to being incredibly messy and just an avoid all around. And as far as Amir Abdullah is concerned, he has been pretty efficient the past 2 weeks, but the total volume just really isn't there. And when Zamir White returns, I just don't see him getting even as much volume as he's getting now. And so I don't think he's a real fantasy option. And so as far as this backfield's concerned, I do think in games in which Zamir White misses, Madison is a decent RB3 or flex play, but I probably, in general, when all are healthy, would just outright avoid this backfield. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield is just a mess, in my opinion. And I don't mean that in a negative way in the sense of how they're performing, but because they're all performing so well. I don't know what's going to happen here. Rachaad White missed this game with a foot injury. And so in his absence, Sean Tucker went 14 for 136, averaging 9.7 per carry with a touchdown and a long of 36. And Bucky Irving, while he wasn't as efficient, he was still awesome. On 14 carries, he had 81 rushing yards, averaging 5.8 per carry with a touchdown himself and a long of 31. Overall, incredibly impressive between both of them. Through the air, Sean Tucker was awesome. On 3 targets, he had 3 receptions, 56 receiving yards, averaging 18.7 per catch and a touchdown with a long of 36. And Bucky Irving was pretty good himself. On 2 targets, he had 2 receptions for 24 receiving yards, averaging 12 per catch with no touchdown and a long of 18. And so overall, it was an awesome week for both running backs. And so this is the second straight week that we've seen a running back no one on earth would have expected to be the RB1, be the RB1. Last week it was Tank Bigsby, and then this week it was Sean Tucker. We still have one game left to play, but there's a decent chance he finishes as the RB1. And so yeah, awesome week all around, but it just makes it that much more confusing as to what's going to happen now. When we take a look at the average snap, rush, and target shares throughout the first 5 weeks compared to what we saw in week 6, on the season, Rachaad White averages 68% of the snaps played, 41.89% of the rush share, and 12.58% of the target share. He did miss this game once again due to a foot injury. And so it is interesting to see, if you look at Bucky Irving's snap share, he played 64% of the snaps. On the season, White plays 68%. And then when we look at Sean Tucker, in this game he played 38%. And on the season, Bucky Irving plays 37%. And so it looks as though with White missing, Bucky Irving pretty much directly took over White's role in terms of the utilization, in terms of at least the snap share. And Sean Tucker directly took over Bucky Irving's role in terms of the snap share. But it doesn't just end there. When we look at Bucky Irving's rush share, in this game he had 40%. On the season, White has 41.89%. And then in this one, Sean Tucker had 40%. And throughout the first 5 weeks, Bucky Irving had 38.26%. When we get to the target share, I do think this one is a little bit fluky, although Sean Tucker is awesome in the passing game. On the season, Bucky Irving has 6.39%, and this one he had 5.56%. And on the season, Sean Tucker has 0.42%, and this one had 8.33%. And so that is the one role that, while it's only a 1-game sample size, it didn't directly correlate to what we saw in the first 5 weeks. But as far as the backfield is concerned, I think that Bucky Irving's definitely on the rise. Rachaad White throughout the first 3 weeks was awesome through the air, Then in weeks 4 and 5 was incredibly inefficient, didn't play this one. And then Sean Tucker really didn't do much and then just blew up in this one. And so it's anyone's guess, in my opinion, as to what the splits are going to look like. And so it's going to be quite interesting to see how the snap, rush, and target shares work themselves out when all three are healthy. Because, I mean, there's no way Sean Tucker didn't earn himself a chunk of the role, right? I mean, he was awesome. And Bucky Irving, while he wasn't quite as good as Sean Tucker in terms of efficiency, he's been amazing this season. And then Rachaad White, to his credit, at least recently on the ground, was pretty good. And in general, he's a good receiving back. And so if Rachaad White does play next week, we definitely are going to need to see how the splits work themselves out in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield. And so we move on to the Broncos backfield. This game was pretty brutal for them. Bo Nix was most of the offense throughout the entire day. He put the team on his back. There was just nothing he could do. He was just outmatched in terms of his roster versus the Chargers roster. When we look at the usage, though, for the running backs, Javonte Williams had 6 carries for 23 rushing yards, averaging 3.8 per carry, no touchdown, and a long of 13. He did lose a fumble in this one, and so he had a very poor fantasy outing. When we look at Estime, he was activated off of IR. He had 2 carries for 13 rushing yards, averaging 6.5 per carry with a long of 11 and no touchdown. Jaleel McLaughlin only had 3 attempts for 8 yards, averaging 2.7 per carry, no touchdown, and a long of 5. And when you look at the receiving work, Javonte on 6 targets was really inefficient. He only had 3 receptions for 13 receiving yards, averaging 4.3 per catch and no touchdown with a long of 10. Jaleel McLaughlin, however, was much more efficient. On 2 targets, he had 2 receptions for 17 receiving yards, averaging 8.5 per catch and no touchdown with a long of 11. And so when we take a look at the season averages throughout the first 5 weeks compared to what we saw in week 6, it is pretty messy. Jaleel McLaughlin on the season played 32% of the snaps, and this one he saw 25%, so that's down. Javonte Williams, however, played much more of the snaps in this one than he did throughout the first 5 weeks on average. He played 67% to his average of 57. Estime's only played 1% on the season. He played 4% in this one, and Tyler Beatty's on IR. Taking a look at the rush share throughout the first 5 weeks for Jaleel McLaughlin, he averages 25.41%. In this one, he only had 16.67%. Javonte Williams on the season averages 43.33%. In this one, he only had 33.33%. And on the season, Estime averages 1.6. In this one, he had 11.11%. When we take a look at the average target shares throughout the first 5 weeks, Jaleel McLaughlin averages 7.8%. In this one, he only had 6.25%. Javonte Williams averages 14.7%. In this one, it went up to 18.75%. And Audric Estime on the season has 0.42% of the total target share, and in this one didn't record a target. And so in this game, the Broncos were losing a lot the entire game. And so it is interesting to see that Javonte Williams saw the field a lot more than he did on average throughout the first 5 weeks, while Jaleel McLaughlin didn't play as much. On an incredibly limited sample size, Estime has been by far the most efficient running back on the ground, although I think he's had a total of 3 carries or something. So that wouldn't put much stake into that. But Jaleel McLaughlin is extremely volatile in terms of his workload on a week-by-week basis. Javonte seems to be getting most of the work, but he just hasn't been that great. And so I think this backfield in general is one to completely avoid unless you are in a very deep league or you are desperate at running back. The final backfield we're going to look at here is the Dallas Cowboys backfield. This game is not going to be anything like, in my opinion, what we normally see from the Cowboys. They were losing the entire game by a lot to the Detroit Lions. And so Rico Dowdle, before this week, had been slowly taking over the backfield incrementally. In this game, however, he did not see remotely the same amount of usage, and I think that's just game script because they probably just didn't want him to get hurt. In this one, he only had 5 carries for 25 rushing yards. That is 5.0 per carry, so pretty efficient. No touchdown with the long of 12. The only other running back to be utilized in this game was Zeke, and so he actually did outcarry him 8-5. However, despite that, he only had 17 rushing yards, averaging 2.1 per carry with a long of 6. And so, not a good game for Zeke. Pretty good game, at least in terms of efficiency from Dowdle. When we look at the receiving game, Zeke was not targeted in this one. Rico Dowdle was heavily targeted, though. On 6 targets, he had 5 receptions for 30 receiving yards, averaging 6.0 per catch with a long of 15 and no touchdown. Not the most efficient night from Rico through the air, but it's good to see him being utilized in the passing game, especially when they're down. I do think that Rico Dowdle is by far and away the running back you want to own here. And I think this is just a blip on the radar because I don't expect the Cowboys to be losing by 40 to 50 every week or really ever again. And so when we look at the season averages, Rico Dowdle averages 45% of the total snaps. In this one, he only played 28%. He averages 45.54% of the rush share. In this one, he only had 29.41%. On the season, he has 6.83% of the target share. And this one, that went up to 13.95%. And so that is good to see when they're trailing at least. Zeke on the season has been trending downwards. He averages 32% of the snaps played. In this one, he played 41%, so that is an increase. On the season, he averages 25.69% of the rush share. In this one, he had 47.06%. And on the season, he has 4.81% of the target share. And in this one, wasn't targeted. And Deuce Vaughn was a healthy scratch in this one, but on the season, he's played 6% of the snaps, had 7.11% of the rush share, and 1.29% of the target share. And so what can we conclude here? I do think this is just a blip on the radar for the Cowboys in terms of Rico Dowdle's perspective. I expect him to easily maintain control over this backfield. He's trending more and more towards being, at the very least, in a timeshare that is heavily slanted his way. If not, though, he's probably trending towards being a featured back at this point. Zeke looks washed. His target share is going down. His rush share is going down, as well as his snap share. And Deuce Vaughn's been a healthy scratch. And so Rico Dowdle is the only running back you want to own out of this backfield. And I think in general, he's probably a mid to low end RB2 on a weekly basis, as long as he's getting a lot of the utilization in the passing game. And he's a decent bet to get a touchdown as well. And so I really like Rico Dowdle. Don't like Zeke. Deuce Vaughn's an afterthought. And so this backfield is certainly trending in Rico Dowdle's direction, despite the fact that this one game wouldn't suggest that. All right, so I think that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield out of all of these is by far the most interesting. I'm very curious to see what the splits look like going forward because there's no way Sean Tucker didn't earn himself somewhat of a role. And all three have looked pretty good recently, so that one will be pretty interesting. What do you think the splits end up looking like between Bucky, Rashad White, and Sean Tucker? Let me know below in the comment section. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard in this video, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.